the spring of 1922, deep in the Bavarian countryside, stood an isolated farm known as Hinterkaifeck. 6 people lived there, but within a single night, every one of them would be murdered. What disturbed investigators most was not just the brutality of the crime, but what happened afterward, because someone stayed behind. For days, the killer continued living inside the house, feeding the animals, lighting the fireplace, and sleeping only a few rooms away from the bodies. Hinterkaifeck was not a place people passed by. The farm stood alone, surrounded by fields and thick woodland. The nearest village was several kilometers away. At night, the only sounds were wind through the trees and the distant cries of farm animals. For the Gruber family, this isolation meant privacy. But in March of 1922, it would become something far more dangerous. The farm belonged to Andreas Gruber, a stern and secretive farmer. Living with him were his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children. A young maid had recently arrived to help run the household. To outsiders, the family appeared ordinary, but neighbors often whispered about strange tensions inside the home. Just days before the murders, Andreas Gruber noticed something strange: fresh footprints in the snow. They led from the nearby forest directly toward the farmhouse. But when he followed the tracks, he discovered something disturbing. There were no footprints leading away. Someone had walked to the farm, but apparently never left. Soon after the footprints appeared, Andreas began hearing noises at night, soft footsteps coming from the attic above the bedrooms. At first he assumed it was an animal, but the sounds continued, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking carefully across the wooden beams, listening, waiting. One morning, Andreas discovered a newspaper lying near the farm. No one in the household had bought it, and no neighbors had visited recently. Someone must have left it there. But who? And more importantly, why had they been near the farm at all? Then another unsettling discovery was made. One of the house keys had disappeared. The family searched the entire farmhouse, but it was gone. Somewhere, someone might now possess a key to the house, and the Gruber family had no idea who it could be. On March 31st, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm. She had only been working there for a few hours. No one could have imagined that she had just walked into one of the most terrifying crime scenes in German history. That evening, the farm slowly grew quiet. Lanterns burned low, animals settled into the barn, and the dark Bavarian forest surrounded the house like a wall. Inside the farmhouse, 6 people prepared to sleep. None of them knew someone else might already be inside the building. Sometime during the night, someone inside the house walked toward the barn. Perhaps they heard a noise. Perhaps they were called outside. What happened next remains unclear, but investigators believe the killer waited in the darkness, holding a farming tool known as a mattock. And when the first victim stepped inside the barn, the attack began. The barn at Hinterkaifeck stood only a few steps from the farmhouse. Inside, the air was cold and thick with the smell of hay and livestock. On that night in March 1922, someone was waiting there, hidden in the shadows. Investigators would later believe that the killer lured the family members into the barn one by one. Each person likely heard a noise or a call for help, and each person walked into the darkness, never realizing they were walking straight toward their killer. One of the first victims investigators believe entered the barn was Victoria Gabriel. Perhaps she heard a strange sound from outside. Perhaps she went to check on the animals. What she saw inside the barn will never be known. But moments after stepping through the door, she was attacked. The weapon used was a mattock, a heavy farming tool designed for chopping soil. In the hands of a killer, it became something far more deadly. Soon after Victoria, another member of the family approached the barn. Perhaps they had noticed she had not returned. Perhaps they heard a cry for help. What investigators later discovered suggested something horrifying. Each victim had been killed in nearly the same spot, one after another, as if the killer had remained waiting in the darkness for the next person to arrive. By the time the attack ended inside the barn, 4 members of the Gruber family lay dead. The elderly couple Andreas and Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and young Cecilia Gabriel. The killer had struck each victim with brutal force, but the horror of that night was far from over, because 2 more people were still inside the house. Inside the farmhouse, the newly arrived maid, Maria Baumgartner, remained unaware of what had happened outside. She had arrived at Hinterkaifeck only hours earlier. She had barely begun her first day of work. Sometime later that night, the killer entered the house. The youngest victim in the house was 2-year-old Josef. He slept quietly in his crib that night. Investigators later discovered that the child had also been killed. The brutality of the crime shocked even the most experienced detectives. Whoever committed these murders had shown no mercy. By the end of that night, 6 people were dead. The isolated farm fell completely silent. But something even more disturbing would soon be discovered, because the killer did not leave. Instead, someone continued living on the farm. In the days following the murders, neighbors noticed something strange. Smoke continued rising from the farmhouse chimney. Someone was still lighting fires in the stove. Animals inside the barn were being fed, yet no one had seen the Gruber family. When investigators later examined the farm, they discovered that the animals had been cared for. The cows had been milked. The barn had been maintained. Whoever committed the murders had remained there, living in the farmhouse, for several days. As the days passed without seeing the family, neighbors began to grow uneasy. Something was wrong at Hinterkaifeck. The mail had not been collected. The family had not attended church, and no one had seen them in the nearby village. Soon, someone decided to investigate. 4 days passed after the night of the murders. The Gruber family had not been seen in the nearby village. Mail remained untouched. The farm appeared strangely quiet. At first, neighbors assumed the family had simply been busy with farm work. But as the silence continued, a growing sense of unease began to spread through the community. Eventually, several neighbors decided to check on the farm. They walked across the fields toward the isolated property. From a distance, everything looked normal. Smoke had been seen rising from the chimney earlier that day. The animals inside the barn could be heard moving. But strangely, no one answered when they called out. The neighbors approached the barn first. The large wooden doors stood slightly open. Inside, the animals were alive and well. The cows had been fed. The stalls were clean. Whoever had taken care of the farm animals had done so recently. But something else inside the barn immediately caught their attention. Lying in the hay, they found the bodies. 4 members of the Gruber family were stacked together on the barn floor. The scene was so disturbing that some witnesses later struggled to describe it. The victims had suffered brutal blows to the head. The weapon used was believed to be a mattock, a farming tool that had been turned into a weapon of unimaginable violence. After the discovery in the barn, the neighbors feared the worst. They rushed toward the farmhouse. The front door creaked open slowly. Inside, the house was strangely quiet. But the horror inside the barn had only been part of the story. Inside one of the bedrooms, they discovered the body of the maid, Maria Baumgartner. She had only arrived at the farm hours before the murders. She had barely begun her new job, and now she had become one of the victims of the mysterious killer. The final discovery came in a small bedroom. 2-year-old Josef was found in his crib. The brutality of the crime shocked even the hardened investigators who later arrived at the scene. If you enjoy disturbing true stories and unexplained mysteries, make sure to follow this channel, because every week we uncover new cases that will make you question what is real. Stories hidden in the dark corners of history, cases investigators still struggle to explain. And trust me, the next story might be even more terrifying. So follow the channel and step deeper into the unknown. 6 lives had been taken in a single night, and no one in the nearby village had heard a thing. News of the discovery spread quickly. Local authorities were immediately notified. Within hours, investigators arrived at Hinterkaifeck. But by the time police reached the farm, dozens of curious villagers had already gathered at the property, and the crime scene had already been disturbed. As investigators examined the farm, they quickly realized something terrifying. The killer had not fled immediately after the murders. Evidence suggested that someone had remained inside the house for several days. Food had been eaten, animals had been fed, and the fireplace had been used, which meant the killer had been living on the farm with the bodies. Despite the brutality of the murders, there were no witnesses, no clear suspects, and very little physical evidence. The isolated location of the farm had turned Hinterkaifeck into the perfect place for a crime to occur unnoticed. And as investigators began their search for answers, they quickly realized something disturbing. This mystery would not be easy to solve. During the search of the farm, investigators discovered the weapon believed to have been used in the murders. A mattock, a heavy farming tool with a sharp blade used for digging and chopping. The weapon had been hidden inside the barn. It belonged to the farm itself, which meant something deeply disturbing. The killer had not brought the weapon with them. They had used what they found at the farm. If the weapon came from the farm, then the killer may have already been familiar with the property. Someone who knew where tools were kept. Someone who knew the layout of the buildings. Someone who could move around the farm without attracting suspicion. This possibility immediately changed the direction of the investigation, because it suggested the killer might not have been a stranger. As investigators examined the house, they noticed something strange about the attic. The wooden floorboards showed signs of recent disturbance. Small pieces of hay had fallen through cracks in the ceiling. It was possible someone had been hiding there, watching the family from above, waiting for the right moment to strike. When neighbors were questioned, some recalled something unsettling. Andreas Gruber had once mentioned hearing footsteps in the attic. At the time, he assumed it was an animal, But now investigators wondered something else. What if those sounds had not been animals at all? What if someone had been living inside the attic, days before the murders happened? Investigators soon learned about the strange footprints Andreas had seen days earlier. Tracks leading from the forest toward the farmhouse, but none leading away. If those tracks belonged to the killer, then they may have arrived days before the murders, and possibly never left the property until after the crime. Another disturbing detail soon surfaced. One of the house keys had disappeared before the murders. The family had searched for it, but never found it. Investigators considered a frightening possibility. Someone could have been entering the farmhouse at night, long before the murders occurred. Investigators also learned about the mysterious newspaper Andreas had discovered. No one in the household had purchased it. No neighbors had visited recently, which meant someone else had likely brought it to the farm. Someone who had been nearby, watching. As the investigation continued, detectives began interviewing villagers. Many theories quickly emerged. Some believed the murders were motivated by revenge. Others suspected family disputes. But without clear evidence, every theory remained uncertain. One of the most disturbing discoveries was the timeline. Evidence suggested the killer had remained at the farm for several days. They fed the animals. They used the kitchen. They even lit fires in the stove, which meant the murderer had been calmly living inside the house while the bodies remained nearby. Despite days of investigation, no clear suspect emerged. The isolated farm had become the center of a growing mystery. A brutal crime, strange warnings before the murders, and a killer who may have been hiding inside the property for days. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger the case became. As detectives interviewed villagers, another unsettling detail began to emerge. The Gruber family had not been well liked in the community. Neighbors described Andreas Gruber as a harsh and controlling man. There were rumors of arguments inside the household, and whispers that the family had many secrets. Secrets that might have given someone a reason to seek revenge. One of the first suspects investigators considered was a nearby neighbor. He had once worked on the farm, and according to some villagers, he had been involved in disputes with the Gruber family. But without strong evidence, police could not prove his involvement, and the investigation continued. Investigators also spoke with the family's previous maid. She had left the farm shortly before the murders. Her reason for leaving was unusual. She claimed the house was haunted. She said she often heard footsteps in the attic at night. Footsteps that terrified her so much she refused to continue working there. As the investigation spread through the village, rumors began to grow. Some believed the murders were connected to family disputes. Others believed the killer had been hiding on the farm long before the crime. But no matter how many rumors circulated, none of them led police any closer to the truth. Some villagers claimed they had seen strangers near the farm in the days before the murders. Unfamiliar figures walking along the forest path. But in a rural region where travelers sometimes passed through, it was difficult to know if these sightings meant anything at all. Still, investigators could not ignore the possibility. Police also explored the possibility of robbery. But when the farmhouse was searched, money and valuables were still inside the home. Nothing significant appeared to have been taken, which raised an even darker possibility. the murders may not have been about money at all. Some investigators began considering a far more personal motive. The brutality of the crime suggested anger. The killer had struck the victims repeatedly. The attacks were not quick. They were violent and deliberate, which suggested the murderer may have known the family. As weeks passed, police expanded their investigation across the surrounding region. Dozens of suspects were questioned. Farm workers, neighbors, travelers, anyone who might have been near Hinterkaifeck during the days leading up to the murders. But every lead eventually ended the same way, with no answers. The longer the case remained unsolved, the stranger it seemed. There were warnings before the murders, footprints in the snow, sounds in the attic, a missing key, a mysterious newspaper, and a killer who stayed inside the house for days. All of it suggested careful planning, but no one could explain who had done it. Months passed, then years. The investigation continued, but the truth remained hidden. The Hinterkaifeck murders had become one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in German history. And the question investigators feared the most still remained unanswered. Who had been living inside the farmhouse with the bodies? As the investigation continued, one theory began to trouble detectives more than any other. The killer may have been someone familiar with the farm. Someone who knew where the tools were kept. Someone who knew how the animals were cared for. And someone who knew the habits of the Gruber family. If this theory was true, then the murderer had not just visited the farm, they had studied it. Another theory soon emerged. Investigators believed the killer may have been hiding inside the attic for days before the murders, watching the family, listening to their movements, waiting for the right moment. The strange footsteps reported by Andreas Gruber, the disturbed attic floorboards, and the falling hay, all pointed toward a chilling possibility. Someone may have been living above them. If the killer had indeed been hiding in the attic, then the murders were not random. They had been carefully planned. The attacker would have known when the family slept, when they worked, and when they were alone, which meant the killer may have been observing the family for days, possibly even weeks. Another theory suggested the murders were fueled by rage. The repeated blows to the victims indicated intense violence. Some investigators believed the killer may have been motivated by personal hatred toward the family. If that was the case, then the suspect was likely someone who knew the victims well. Someone with a reason to seek revenge. Several villagers later claimed they had seen a stranger near the farm in the days before the murders. A figure walking along the forest edge, watching the property from a distance. But by the time investigators began searching for this mysterious person, the trail had long gone cold. Some detectives believed the crime may have involved more than one person. 6 victims, a large farm, and a killer who remained there for days. It was possible that more than one individual had been involved in the attack. But without witnesses or clear evidence, this theory remained uncertain. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of the case was the silence. No one in the nearby village reported hearing screams. No one heard the attack. Despite the brutality of the crime, the night had remained eerily quiet, as if the farm itself had swallowed the sound. Eventually, whoever had committed the murders disappeared. No one saw them leave the farm. No suspicious travelers were found nearby. It was as if the killer had simply vanished into the surrounding countryside, leaving behind only questions. Even experienced detectives struggled to understand the crime. The clues seemed to suggest careful planning, but the lack of evidence made solving the case nearly impossible. The Hinterkaifeck murders soon became a mystery that haunted investigators for decades. As years passed, the story of Hinterkaifeck began to spread. Some people believed the killer had escaped justice forever. Others believed the truth had been hidden. But one thing was certain. The isolated farm had become the site of one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in history. After the investigation ended, the Hinterkaifeck farm remained standing. But something about the place had changed. The once quiet farmland now carried a dark reputation. Few people were willing to pass near the property, and those who did often said the farm felt strangely unsettling, as if the land itself remembered what had happened there. Just 1 year after the murders, the farmhouse was demolished. The buildings were torn down completely. Many believed destroying the property might finally erase the memory of the tragedy. But instead, the mystery only grew stronger. After the original farm was removed, a new structure was built nearby. But even with a new building standing in its place, the story of the murders refused to disappear. The land had already become part of local legend. As decades passed, the world changed. Wars came and went, villages expanded, but the story of Hinterkaifeck remained frozen in time. A crime that had never been solved, a mystery that refused to fade. Over the years, investigators reopened the case several times. New detectives studied the evidence. Modern theories were explored. But even with advances in forensic science, the truth remained hidden. At different times, various suspects were proposed. Neighbors, travelers, former workers. Some theories seemed convincing. Others quickly fell apart. But none of them could be proven with certainty. One disturbing theory suggested the killer had been someone close to the family. Someone who understood their routines. Someone who knew exactly how to lure them into the barn. If that theory was true, then the killer may have blended into the community afterward, living quietly among the villagers. Another theory continued to haunt investigators. The idea that the killer had lived inside the attic before the murders, watching the family, waiting, listening. If true, the Gruber family had unknowingly shared their home with their killer for days. But perhaps the most chilling fact of the entire case remained undeniable. After the murders, the killer stayed. They fed the animals, cooked food, used the stove, and lived inside the farmhouse for several days. Eventually, the killer left. No one saw them leave. No one saw them traveling down the forest paths. No one saw them entering the nearby village. They simply disappeared, leaving only silence behind. Even today, many questions remain unanswered. Who walked toward the farmhouse leaving footprints in the snow? Who hid in the attic? And who murdered 6 people on that isolated farm? As years passed, the story of Hinterkaifeck spread far beyond the small Bavarian village. Writers, journalists, and investigators all attempted to solve the mystery. But the case remained just as baffling as it had been in 1922. For the families involved, the lack of answers made the tragedy even more painful. There had been no arrest, no confession, and no clear explanation. Only silence. Over time, the Hinterkaifeck murders became more than just a crime. They became a legend, a story whispered across generations, a mystery that refused to die. Today, the location where the farm once stood is quiet. Fields stretch across the land, trees sway gently in the wind. Nothing remains of the buildings where the murders took place. But the story remains. 6 lives were lost at Hinterkaifeck. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, young Cecilia, Joseph, and Maria. Their story continues to be remembered more than a century later. Even now, historians and investigators continue studying the case, searching for clues hidden within old records. But so far, the mystery remains unsolved. Perhaps the most chilling thought of all is that the killer may never have been caught. They may have lived the rest of their life in peace. While the truth of Hinterkaifeck remained buried, the buildings are gone, the witnesses are gone. Even the investigators who first studied the case have long since passed away. But the mystery remains. More than a century later, one question still lingers. Who committed the Hinterkaifeck murders? Sometimes the most disturbing mysteries are not the ones we solve, but the ones that remain forever unanswered. Today the fields around Hinterkaifeck are quiet. But for those who know the story, the silence feels different. Some believe the truth may still be hidden somewhere, buried within forgotten records, or remembered only by the land itself. More than 100 years have passed since the murders, yet the story of Hinterkaifeck still fascinates the world. The farm may be gone, but the crime remains frozen in history. A reminder that some mysteries may never be solved. What truly happened that night in March of 1922? Who waited in the barn, and who walked away into the darkness? The answers may never be known, but the story remains. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in history. A mystery passed down through generations. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the story is that the killer may have watched the farmhouse for days, waiting, listening, planning, and somewhere in the dark forests of Bavaria, the truth may still be waiting.